Honeybees, of course, require a lot of maintenance from either beekeepers or farmers. But these wild bees actually don't require any kind of maintenance because they usually occur locally in most habitats. So one common type of wild bee is the sweat bee. They actually get their name because they will land on you and lick the sweat off of your skin. They're usually very brightly colored and occur locally and globally. Another common type of wild bee, which you're probably a little familiar with, is the bumblebee. They're usually easily observed because they're very large, easy to see. Bumblebees are very important pollinators and provide a unique type of pollination service called buzz pollination. This is where they sonicate at just the right frequency to release and transfer pollen from different plants. Some important crops require this type of pollination, and only bumblebees and a couple other bees can do buzz pollination. Plants like tomatoes and peppers, eggplants, blueberries, and cranberries, they all require buzz pollination. Because bumblebees are so important for crop production, a number of bumblebees have become species of conservation concern. In New Hampshire, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has listed 4 bumblebee species as species of greatest conservation concern under the 2015 New Hampshire Wildlife Action Plan. But it's not just bumblebees or the honeybees that aren't doing well. This top study looks at bees worldwide and found that in most countries, the bees are not doing well. Honeybees usually because of colony collapse disorder, and the wild bees usually because of lack of habitat or other resources. The bottom study looks at bees a little bit closer to home, and they found that wild bees in the last 140 years are drastically decreasing. This graph on the top here shows wild bees declining over the last 140 years, while the middle graph just looks at bumblebees and shows that they are also declining at a slightly higher rate. And then this bottom graph looks at exotic introduced species of bees, which have the opposite effect and are actually doing much better. Another study over a 120-year period found that a number of bees are no longer even present in areas where they used to be as recently as 10 to 20 years ago. They use this data to produce a plant pollinator network. So all of the blocks on the left side represent flowers, and all the blocks on the right side are the bees. And then these lines in between are the interactions between the bees and the flowers. The black coloration is good. It represents interactions and species that were present historically and still persist today, whereas the red lines and blocks represent bees and interactions that have been lost due to seasonal mismatches, and the blue lines are also not so good and represent unknown reasons that we've lost these interactions between the bees and the flowers. So figuring out why the bees are not doing well is a complicated problem. There are a number of different factors that can negatively impact the bees, including things like changes in land use, agricultural practice changes, things that fragment the landscape, or simply loss of habitat altogether. Climate change can cause flowers to bloom out of sync with the bees that usually pollinate them. Parasites and pathogens like fungus and mites can also be really bad for the bees. So it's a complicated problem with no easy solution, and we need a holistic approach to try to solve this. So we know that the bees are not doing well, both globally and locally, and from a number of different reasons. But what we don't know is much of the fundamental information about the bees right here in our own backyard. One of the questions we need to ask is, what are the bees of New Hampshire? Because we just don't know right now. So in order to help them, we first have to find out what species are living here in New Hampshire, how they interact within their community, and what are the most important species that we need to be concerned with. So to do this, our lab conducted multiple surveys across Strafford County, and we found over 2,000 bees representing 118 different species in 5 different families. The most abundant bees we found were the bumblebee and the sweat bee. And then to figure out how they're interacting with their community and the flowers around them, we've produced a plant pollinator network. Plant pollinator networks can provide us essential information on bee habitat, community structure, and their floral requirements. So in addition to surveying what bees are here, we also collected data on what the bees are pollinating and produced the first plant pollinator network for northern New England. We surveyed 34 different flowers in 12 different families. The flowers are the green blocks on the left. And we found 63 bee species, which are the blue blocks on the right, and 197 unique interactions between the bees and the flowers, which are the yellow bands in the middle. In addition to this, we collected seasonal information. So these connected green dots on the left indicate when the flowers were blooming and also attractive to the different bees. And then the connected blue dots show when the bees were out and pollinating these flowers. We found that there are actually two keystone bee species here in New Hampshire, a type of bumblebee and a dark-colored sweat bee. These bees pollinated the greatest abundance and diversity of flowers and were around for most of the collecting season. We also found that clovers are very important for the bees. They provided resources for the broadest diversity and abundance of bees. And then weedy species like goldenrod, dandelion, and berry brambles were actually really important too. They provided resources for a diverse selection of bees, just in smaller abundances than the clover. So overall, we found that we need a diverse selection of flowers for the bees, and that here in New Hampshire we have two keystone bee species in the area that we surveyed. So after looking at the complicated interactions of the plant pollinator network and knowing the negative association that agriculture usually has with diversity, we wanted to look at how land use change and different habitats affect the bees here in New Hampshire. To do this, we looked at 3 different habitats: a meadow, an organic farm, and a conventional farm. We surveyed those 3 habitats regularly throughout most of the year, and we found similar trends in seasonal bee diversity. The blue is the spring months, the red is summer, and the green is fall. And we found the fewest bee species around in the spring, the most in the summer, which kind of makes sense, and slightly less for most habitats in the fall. We found a similar trend for bee abundance across the seasons, with spring having the least number of bees, summer the most, and then a little bit less in the fall. This table summarizes all of our data from the habitat comparisons. We have the number of bees that were in each habitat, the number of species of bees that were in each habitat, the number of bees that were only found at one particular kind of habitat, and the number of flowers that were only found at one particular habitat. So when we compare all 3 of these habitats, we actually found that the organic farm supported the greatest diversity and abundance of bees. So contrary to the popular belief that agriculture is bad for bees, we actually found that it supports a larger, more diverse community, here in New Hampshire at least. So one of the reasons the organic farm had more bees than the other 2 habitats is likely the greater diversity of flowers available. This means that there's an easy thing you can do to help support the bee community by simply mowing less and letting some more weedy plants grow. Or if you really want to make the investment, like Kathy went over, you can actually go and plant a pollinator garden to help support them. Another reason the organic farm had more bees than the other 2 habitats is likely the broader availability of nesting sites. So most wild bees either nest in the ground or in dead plant material like hollow sticks, and having a greater availability of this type of material is very beneficial to the bee community. One reason the organic farm likely had more bees than the conventional farm is not using pesticides. So this was found in our comparisons, but also many other studies, that not using pesticides or simply setting aside pesticide-free areas can greatly help the bee community. One program, there's the share program online, actually goes over details on how you can set aside specific areas for bee, for healthy bee communities instead of your entire property, just like small sections, and how that can be helpful. Then there's also this bee-friendly farming initiative, which offers guidelines to farmers on how they can make more bee-friendly habitat areas and actually become a certified bee-friendly farm, which can be good for promoting your crops and products. So to summarize, we found a broad diversity of bees here in New Hampshire. We conducted much needed habitat assessments and comparisons, and we found that in New Hampshire, some amount of agriculture is actually beneficial to the bee community. From these studies, we can now make some recommendations on how to conduct bee-friendly farming and some best practices such as not using or reducing the amount of pesticides and the importance of having a diverse selection of flowers for the bees. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who helped with this project and our many, many undergrads who helped a lot. If there's time, I'll take questions.
Questions? Erica,
Yeah.
what is the bumblebee that is most prevalent?
Bombus impatiens, by far, is the most common bumblebee. Yeah. Yes?
Well, where do they nest? Do they nest in the ground? Or
They do. They nest in the ground. They form these cute little pots of wax for their babies, and they usually have, I don't know, nests from anywhere from like 20 to maybe 200 bees, depending on the size. Yeah?
Great news about the farming being good for the bees.
Right, yeah.
What types of farming were being done at the farms that you?
So we pretty much just divided it into like a conventional type of farm that, does whatever they want, pesticides, tilling, all that. The organic farm pretty much had, I guess it was mostly produce sort of farming there, and they didn't use any kind of pesticides. We didn't look at any kind of cattle farming. That would be another project. Yeah.
So the conventional farm was similar crops
Mm-hmm.
to the...
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, they had plants and produce and.
So they were mainly mixed vegetables?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
And how many conventional, organic, and meadows did you sample?
So we just looked at one, but we surveyed different places throughout the farms, and we did this throughout the year. This is actually only 1 year's worth of data. We're working on compiling a number of different years and adding additional farms, but it's a good start for the first year. Yes?
Back to the bumblebee.
Yeah.
So nesting in the ground, does it require open space? Because some of the ground nesting bees require sort of loose soil.
So.
What habitat do they require?
So they'll usually find area if it's undisturbed. If it doesn't have a bunch of grass or other plant material, like just kind of bare ground, that's usually the best for bumblebees. But if you simply leave areas without, tilling or other kind of mechanical activity, usually they can figure out a way to make that work for habitat.
Great. Thank you.